Hello, ladies and gentlemen. A society is only as stable as the rights it guarantees to its citizens. When we talk about civil rights, we're not just discussing legal technicalities or abstract principles, we're addressing the very foundation of individual dignity, freedom, and responsibility. And yet we see again and again encroachments on these rights, justified under the guise of security, equity, or collective well-being. It is a dangerous game, one that has been played many times throughout history, always with disastrous consequences. A violation of civil rights is not merely an inconvenience or an unfortunate bureaucratic oversight. It is a signal of a deeper pathology, an indication that the structures we rely upon to uphold fairness and justice have begun to erode. And these violations don't occur in isolation. They are often embedded within ideological frameworks that devalue the sovereignty of the individual in favor of some abstract collective ideal. This is the road to tyranny, and it is paved with the language of compassion and necessity. The very notion of a right implies something inviolable, something granted not by the state but recognized by it. It is not the government that bestows these rights, rather it is the government's duty to protect them. But the state, being an entity that consolidates power by its very nature, is always tempted to infringe upon these rights in pursuit of its own interests. And when it does so incrementally, not with a bang, but with a whisper. Not with an open declaration of oppression, but with a careful, calculated shift in language and policy that frames each erosion as an improvement. The greatest violations of civil rights are often those that disguise themselves as acts of virtue. Censorship is framed as protection from harm. Forced conformity is labeled as unity. Suppression of dissent is rebranded as the preservation of social harmony, and people desperate for order often accept these violations under the illusion that they are necessary, that they are for the greater good. But history is very clear on this matter. The justification of oppression is always clothed in moral rhetoric. Always. And when people surrender their rights, when they allow fear or complacency to dictate their willingness to stand up for what is true, they open the door to an ever-expanding authority that recognizes no limits. There is no endpoint to tyranny. There is only its continuation until people decide that enough is enough. So, the question is not whether civil rights will be violated. The question is whether people will have the strength to recognize it when it happens, and the courage to resist it before it's too late. And that, in the end, is the real test of a free society. Civil rights are the foundation of individual dignity and freedom because they provide the necessary framework for individuals to live with autonomy, self-respect, and moral responsibility. Without civil rights, a person is not truly free. They are merely subject to the whims of authority, constrained by an arbitrary system that dictates the conditions of their existence. The essence of human dignity lies in the ability to make choices, to express oneself without fear, and to participate fully in the social, political, and economic fabric of society. Civil rights ensure that these fundamental aspects of existence are not only recognized but protected. At the core of this idea is the recognition that individuals are not merely components of a larger collective. They are sovereign beings, each with their own values, ambitions, and perspectives. When civil rights are upheld, individuals are free to pursue their own paths, speak their minds, and live according to their conscience. This is essential for the development of personal identity and the exercise of responsibility. People must be able to make choices, real choices, if they are to cultivate virtue, wisdom, and resilience. A society that strips individuals of their rights also strips them of the opportunity to grow into competent, ethical beings capable of making meaningful contributions to the world. Freedom, however, is not merely the absence of external constraints, it is also the presence of legitimate safeguards against oppression. Civil rights provide these safeguards by placing clear limitations on the power of the state and other institutions. The right to free speech, for instance, ensures that individuals can voice their thoughts without fear of persecution. The right to due process ensures that no one can be arbitrarily imprisoned or punished without proper legal proceedings. The right to property ensures that individuals have control over the fruits of their labor. Each of these rights is a barrier against tyranny, a recognition that power, when left unchecked, tends to encroach upon personal liberty. A society that respects civil rights is one in which individuals are not merely subjects of authority, but active participants in shaping their own destinies. This participation is crucial, not only for the well-being of the individual, but also for the stability of society itself. When people feel that their rights are protected, they develop a sense of ownership over their lives and communities. They become engaged citizens rather than passive observers. They innovate, create, and contribute because they know that their efforts will not be arbitrarily taken away or rendered meaningless by authoritarian interference. But when civil rights are violated, when people are silenced, stripped of their autonomy, or treated as mere instruments of state policy, society begins to unravel. The individual loses confidence in their ability to act with agency, and the state, unchecked, expands its influence into every facet of life. This is the road to oppression, and history has demonstrated time and time again that societies which fail to uphold civil rights inevitably descend into control, corruption, and collapse. Civil rights are not negotiable, they are the foundation of everything that makes life meaningful. The erosion of civil rights does not happen suddenly or with a single dramatic event. Instead, it is a slow, incremental process, often unnoticed by those who are not paying close attention. This gradual decline occurs in small steps, each one justified by seemingly reasonable arguments: security, stability, fairness, or the greater good. It is not an overt attack on freedom, but a series of minor concessions that, over time, accumulate into a fundamental shift in the structure of society. One of the primary reasons civil rights are eroded incrementally is that outright oppression would provoke immediate resistance. People recognize an obvious dictatorship, they rebel against visible chains, but when freedoms are taken away gradually, the loss is harder to perceive and resistance becomes less likely. If a government were to declare that free speech is abolished overnight, the backlash would be immediate and overwhelming. However, if speech is restricted subtly through social pressure, regulations, and vague laws that punish misinformation or hate speech without clear definitions, people may not even notice until their ability to express themselves has been severely limited. This slow erosion is often facilitated by crises. Emergencies create fear, and fear makes people more willing to sacrifice their rights in exchange for a sense of safety. Governments understand this well. During times of war, pandemics, or economic instability, citizens are more likely to accept new laws and restrictions that they would otherwise reject. These laws are often presented as temporary measures, but history shows that once a government gains new powers, it is rarely willing to give them back. What begins as an exception soon becomes the norm. The people, having adapted to the new restrictions, grow accustomed to their diminished freedoms, and the process continues. Another mechanism of incremental erosion is the use of ambiguous or expanding definitions of legality. When laws are vague, enforcement becomes selective, allowing those in power to apply them in ways that suit their interests. A law that punishes extremism might sound reasonable, but what qualifies as extremism? If the definition is left open-ended, it can be stretched to include almost anything. Over time, more and more forms of expression, behavior, or association can be classified as dangerous or unacceptable, leading to a quiet but powerful suppression of individual rights. Compounding this problem is the role of social and cultural forces. When violations of civil rights are framed as morally necessary, people are less likely to resist them. A person who values free speech might hesitate to defend it if doing so means being labeled as intolerant. A person who believes in due process might stay silent if the accused is unpopular. The erosion of civil rights, then, is not only a legal or political issue, it is also a psychological and cultural one. By the time people realize how much they have lost, it is often too late. The institutions meant to protect rights have already been weakened, and the social habits of resistance have eroded. Reversing the damage requires immense effort, and history shows that once freedoms are lost, they are not easily regained. The only defense against this gradual decline is constant vigilance, an awareness that every small concession must be scrutinized, and a willingness to push back before the erosion becomes irreversible. The state is naturally inclined to overreach because power, by its very nature, seeks to expand. Governments, regardless of their initial intentions, tend to accumulate authority over time, justifying their growing influence with arguments about security, stability, and the well-being of the population. This tendency is not necessarily driven by outright malice or conspiracy. It is often the simple result of bureaucracy, self-preservation, and the logic of centralization. The state, once it has a mechanism for control, rarely relinquishes it voluntarily. Instead, it finds new ways to justify its continued expansion, often under the pretense of necessity. At its core, the state is an institution designed to enforce order, mediate conflicts, and provide basic structures for society. However, the very mechanisms that allow it to function also create the conditions for overreach. Laws require enforcement, and enforcement requires agencies' oversight and funding. Each new regulation demands a body to administer it. Each new crisis demands a solution that typically involves increased governmental authority. Over time, these small additions accumulate, creating a sprawling apparatus of control that far exceeds what was originally envisioned. One of the primary reasons the state tends to overreach is its monopolization of force. Unlike other institutions in society, the state holds the exclusive right to use violence legally. It controls the police, the military, the judicial system, and regulatory agencies that have the power to fine, imprison, or otherwise punish individuals and organizations. With this monopoly comes the temptation to use force as a primary means of achieving objectives. Instead of persuading people or allowing free market solutions to arise, the state finds it easier to mandate, regulate, and prohibit. Over time, this reliance on force becomes one of the most effective, leading to an ever-expanding role for the government. When a nation faces war, terrorism, economic collapse, or a public health emergency, citizens become more willing to accept restrictions on their freedoms in exchange for security. Leaders, sensing both an opportunity and a necessity, introduce emergency measures, often with assurances that they are temporary. However, history demonstrates that such measures frequently outlast the crisis that justified them. The power to monitor citizens, regulate businesses, censor speech, or detain individuals without trial is difficult to relinquish once granted. The Patriot Act in the United States, passed after 9/11, is a prime example. Initially presented as a response to an urgent security threat, many of its provisions remain in place decades later. Bureaucracy itself fuels government overreach. Unlike businesses, which must respond to market forces, government agencies have no natural competition. Once an agency is established, it develops a self-sustaining cycle. It justifies its existence by expanding its functions, securing more funding, and increasing its regulatory reach. The individuals working within these institutions have an interest in maintaining and growing their influence, as their careers depend on it. This bureaucratic inertia means that once a government program or regulation is in place, it is rarely dismantled, even if it is no longer necessary. Another key factor in state overreach is the ideological justification for control. Throughout history, rulers and politicians have framed their authority as necessary for the greater good. Whether in the name of equality, safety, morality, or national unity, governments have consistently argued that expanding their power is beneficial for society as a whole. This argument is persuasive because it appeals to people's sense of duty and collective responsibility. However, the problem arises when this justification is used to suppress individual rights. A government that claims to protect its citizens from misinformation, for example, may begin censoring dissenting voices. A government that seeks to ensure economic fairness may impose controls that stifle innovation and personal responsibility. Ultimately, the tendency of the state to overreach is a structural issue rather than a partisan one. It is not confined to any particular political ideology. Both left-wing and right-wing governments have demonstrated this tendency throughout history. The only real defense against government overreach is a vigilant and engaged population, citizens who understand that power must always be constrained and that rights, once surrendered, are seldom regained. The state does not naturally limit itself, it must be limited by those it governs. If people fail to recognize this reality, they will find themselves living under an ever-expanding system of control, one that did not arrive all at once but grew piece by piece while they were too distracted or complacent to resist. Tyranny is always disguised as virtue because the most effective way to control people is to convince them that oppression is for their own good. Rarely does tyranny emerge in the form of an obvious dictatorship with open declarations of power. Instead, it presents itself as necessary, even moral, wrapped in the language of justice, security, equality, or public well-being. It is not imposed suddenly, but introduced gradually, making it difficult for people to recognize it for what it truly is. This phenomenon is as old as civilization itself. In almost every instance of authoritarian rule, the justification for expanding power has been framed as a moral necessity. Governments do not say, "We will take away your freedoms because we crave control." Instead, they say, "We must limit certain freedoms to protect you, to ensure fairness, to maintain stability." The people, conditioned to trust authority and desiring security, often accept these restrictions without questioning their long-term consequences. One of the most common disguises of tyranny is the promise of safety. Fear is a powerful tool for manipulation, and leaders throughout history have used it to convince people that extraordinary measures are required for their protection. Whether the threat is terrorism, disease, or social unrest, the solution proposed by the state is almost always the same: more control, more surveillance, more restrictions on individual behavior. These measures are rarely reversed when the crisis passes. Instead, they become permanent fixtures of governance. Each time the state expands its power in the name of security, it establishes a precedent that makes future expansions easier. The result is a slow but steady erosion of civil liberties, justified at every step by the need to keep people safe. Another form of tyranny disguised as virtue is the pursuit of equality. While fairness and justice are noble goals, history has shown that governments often use these ideals to justify extreme and oppressive policies. In the name of leveling the playing field, they may restrict free speech, seize property, or impose draconian regulations that stifle individual ambition and responsibility. The rhetoric is always the same: some people have too much, others have too little, therefore we must intervene. But when governments position themselves as the arbiters of fairness, they assume the power to dictate outcomes, inevitably leading to coercion and control. True equality cannot be achieved through force without creating an authoritarian system that punishes success and rewards dependency. Tyranny also disguises itself as social harmony. Dissent is framed as divisiveness, and the suppression of unpopular opinions is justified as necessary for maintaining peace. Censorship is not described as an attack on free expression, but as a way to protect people from harmful or offensive ideas. The result is an environment where individuals become afraid to speak openly, where public discourse is carefully managed, and where only state-approved narratives are allowed to thrive. This kind of ideological control is one of the hallmarks of totalitarianism, yet it is often welcomed by the very people it oppresses under the belief that it serves the greater good. Perhaps the most insidious disguise of tyranny is its appeal to morality. Many of the greatest atrocities in history were carried out under the banner of moral righteousness. From the Inquisition to political purges, from forced collectivization to modern-day censorship, every act of oppression has been justified as necessary to protect society from dangerous elements. People are more willing to accept control when they believe it aligns with their moral beliefs. This is why tyrannical regimes invest so much effort in controlling education, media, and cultural institutions, because shaping the moral framework of a population ensures compliance without the need for overt force. The greatest danger of tyranny disguised as virtue is that it turns people into willing participants in their own oppression. When individuals believe they are acting in the name of righteousness, they become blind to the consequences of the policies they support. They justify censorship because they believe it prevents harm. They justify government overreach because they believe it ensures equality. They justify surveillance because they believe it enhances security. In doing so, they sacrifice the very freedoms that make a society truly just. Recognizing tyranny requires the ability to see beyond noble rhetoric and examine the mechanisms of control beneath it. True virtue does not require coercion. Justice does not demand the suppression of individual rights. Security does not justify permanent restrictions on freedom. And fairness cannot be achieved through force. A society that fails to distinguish between genuine virtue and tyranny disguised as virtue is doomed to repeat the mistakes of history, surrendering its liberty in exchange for illusions of safety and morality. History is clear. Societies that trade rights for security collapse because the fundamental bargain they make is ultimately unsustainable. At first, the exchange seems reasonable. People surrender certain freedoms in order to feel safer, trusting that the government will protect them from threats. However, once rights are given up, they are rarely returned. The government, having gained new powers, finds reasons to retain and expand them. Over time, the balance between freedom and security shifts too far toward control, leading to an authoritarian state that no longer serves its people but instead rules over them. One of the most well-known historical examples of this is the fall of the Roman Republic. In times of crisis, the Roman Senate granted extraordinary powers to military leaders under the justification of maintaining stability. Julius Caesar, for instance, was appointed dictator not as a tyrant but as a protector of Rome. However, once he consolidated power, he did not relinquish it. His successors continued this trend, and what was once a republic governed by elected officials became an empire ruled by autocrats. The citizens, in their desire for security amidst political turmoil, had traded their rights away, and in doing so, they lost the very freedoms that had made Rome great. The pattern repeats itself throughout history. After the French Revolution, the people of France sought stability following years of chaos and bloodshed. In their desperation, they accepted the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte, who promised order and national glory. He declared himself emperor, curtailed freedoms, and led France into endless wars. The initial promise of security had turned into dictatorship, and the rights of the people were all but erased. The 20th century provides even starker examples. In Nazi Germany, the Reichstag fire of 1933 was used as a pretext to pass the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended civil liberties and gave Adolf Hitler the power to suppress political opposition. The German people, fearful of communist threats and economic collapse, accepted these measures in exchange for security. What followed was one of the most oppressive regimes in history. The same pattern occurred in the Soviet Union under Stalin, in Maoist China, and in countless other authoritarian states. The promise of protection against internal or external enemies became the justification for mass surveillance, censorship, and the elimination of political opponents. Even in democratic societies, the tension between rights and security is a constant struggle. The post 9/11 era saw the expansion of government surveillance programs in the United States, such as the Patriot Act. Initially justified as necessary for national security, these measures granted the government broad powers to monitor citizens, collect data, and bypass legal safeguards. While the threat of terrorism was real, the long-term consequence was a significant reduction in personal privacy. The lesson from history is simple: a society that willingly surrenders its rights for the promise of security does not remain free for long. Governments rarely relinquish power once they have acquired it, and citizens who grow accustomed to control become increasingly passive. True security is not achieved through oppression, but through the protection of individual liberties. A people who prioritize freedom over fear will build a resilient, thriving society. A people who give up their rights in exchange for safety will, in the end, have neither. Do that if enough individuals decide that they are willing to bear the responsibility of their own freedom, then the tide turns. That's how it's always been. And that's how it always will be.